a future in which we can come through with equitable prosperity, where we can see a resilient environment, and of course, better health for all. And so there are challenges in this, and some of those challenges in capacity is bringing in the voices from different parts of the community through science to deliver for all of Australia. And today we have a really great opportunity against that backdrop to discuss the issues around how we build diversity for STEM. And in particular, we will have the opportunity to focus on how we bring voices of women through leadership, through their contribution, and from early on in education right through to leadership positions, whether that be in education, in industry, in all fields in which STEM will begin and through STEM will make that major impact for us all. So we've got a great panel to discuss some of the issues which are about what might hold back that move to build diversity for STEM, and where some of the solutions might be, both from a particular personal perspective of our panel members and also from a systems perspective, and indeed globally. And so we've got an excellent panel today. We've got a panel of world-class scientists from right here in Adelaide who bring different perspectives in different fields, and we're also delighted today that we have with us our Commissioner for Equal Opportunity in South Australia. So without more ado, I'm going to walk across the panel, as it were, and introduce our panel members. And the first panel member, right to my left, Professor Emily Hilder. Now, Professor Hilde is an analytical chemist, and her work actually focuses on the design and development of new materials, polymeric materials, I should say, that can be used to improve analysis and analytic measurements, and then the use and application of these technologies for bioanalysis and indeed disease diagnosis. She was included in the Analytical Scientists Top 40 Under 40 in that power list in 2014, and as one of the top 10 leaders in analytical science in 2017. She's a fellow of the Royal Australian Chemical Institute and a fellow of Australian Academy of Technological Sciences. Currently, she is the director of the Future Industries Institute at the University of South Australia, and really working to build collaboration together with researchers and industry, really to transform industries of today to meet future needs. So welcome, Emma. Our next panelist is Professor Laura Parry, and Professor Parry is currently the Interim Executive Dean in Sciences at the University of Adelaide. Now, Laura has a remarkable history, a record of distinction in the biological sciences, particularly through her groundbreaking research in reproductive and vascular biology research. From 2015 until 2019, she was Professor in Biosciences and Associate Dean of Research and Industry in the Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne, before she saw the light and came across to South Australia, where she was appointed the Head of School of Biological Sciences. And indeed, in September of this year, she was appointed the Interim Dean of that faculty. And in that role, she is also pursuing that strategic engagement between great research, offering value and innovation to industry in the fields of health and biotech. And she's also with a focus in the faculty on environmental sciences, particularly that overarching challenge of environmental sustainability. Welcome, Laura. And just towards the end of the table, Professor Karen Reynolds. Now, Professor Reynolds is a remarkable leader in biomedical engineering and is currently the director of the Medical Device Research Institute and the Medical Device Partnering Program at Flinders University. Her work bridges that divide again between research and industry, And the Medical Device Partnering Program, which she has led, is now a national program, offering the opportunity for Australia at large to harness the lessons learned, the know-how developed by Professor Reynolds and her team at Flinders to really build a vibrant medical devices industry in Australia. She's an honorary fellow of Engineers Australia, and in 2017 was awarded the Engineers Australia David Dewhurst Award, and in 2016, my apologies, in 2012, she was awarded South Australian Scientist of the Year. She's also elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and holds a number of external roles. So welcome, Karen. And finally, but absolutely a key to this discussion, and we're really looking forward to the learnings and input from our South Australian Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, who is, of course, Dr. Nikki Vincent. Now, Nikki, of course, is a remarkable leader, and she is also the head and chair of the Chiefs for Gender Equity, of which this group and this conversation is really originated from discussions around that table. She has, of course, in her role, statutory powers to assess and conciliate complaints of discrimination and inform the community about their rights and responsibilities under equal opportunity laws. But she also chairs and harnesses the leadership role she has, not only to identify issues that are problems, but to create solutions to those problems and to navigate those through the political process. She also currently chairs the Australian Council of Human Rights Authorities. She serves on the National Management Committee of Play by the Rules and is a member of the Advisory Council for the Committee of Economic Development, CEDA. And in addition, she's a very active ambassador for Time for Kids, a respite foster care organisation. In her CV, she notes she has 94 adult children, but grandmother to 9. So I think this is a voice of experience. So look, thank you very much, and welcome all to this discussion. So perhaps, Emily, we might start with yourself. In the prequel, I was sort of summarising, you know, diversity for STEM seems to have been a bit of a wicked problem for the science community, and up until 12 to 18 months ago, we've seen many efforts to address this kind of really what's been a wicked problem for science in general, probably since science was first practiced. We could discuss why that is, but it certainly has been the case in Australia that the voices of women in science and women leadership has really been in the minority. Now, we've just come through, and we're not through yet, as some of the biggest challenges that science has been asked to face to support the economic and social transition of Australia as it navigates these natural disasters, bushfire management, and also, of course, the pandemic. So do you see this last period of time providing an impetus for better solutions to bring in and the voices of more scientists, and particularly to address the issues facing women in science? Or do you think it just poses another challenge on top of a number of challenges?
Oh, it's not the easy one, Caroline. I actually think that it's a bit of both. So I see both there. I think the challenges are because of so we have a wicked challenge here. And the fact that we can't sort of say, yep, done, dusted, we've sorted that, means that we are at a point where the pressures that we're under across all sectors exacerbate the challenges for any group that's in a minority. Mm-hmm. So when we put things in place to try and address the balance, to try to make places more inclusive, we then have the challenge of, when under pressure, conversations this morning about the challenges of budgets and what budgets are going to look like across the board this year. it then becomes very difficult under those pressures to maintain things that we've put in place to try and manage the difficulties that we're in. So I think it's absolutely clear that the impact in particular on women and other groups that are less well represented in STEM is disproportionately greater. But I'm an optimist and I always like to look at the positives in things. And I would say what I have seen is that the fact that we've had to change our behaviours rather suddenly provides us with real opportunities to turn that around or to change that very quickly. I'm just going to give one example. Very early on, we had to go to meetings virtually, not face to face. And like almost anyone else, we were talking here before about online teaching. I find it very difficult. I find online meetings very difficult, and I wouldn't have ever chosen that. But I went very quickly, for example, with my research leaders in the institute and said, well, to start with, we were meeting daily. We still meet weekly. And we went to having these meetings by Zoom through necessity, but then discovered that it created a whole new level of inclusion that we'd never seen before. So whereas I would have in the past had someone said to me, oh, I'm just going to work at home this week, thought, what's going on at home this week? I think nothing of it now. I see women in particular who would have told me that they would have been embarrassed to ask if we could have a video link so they could join a meeting, joining in, and not just joining the meeting, but contributing to that meeting in ways that they wouldn't have in the past. And have some colleagues who've told me that they've never felt more included in the institute than since we've come into this pandemic situation. So I think that there's a lot to learn from that about how this sudden change and this imperative to change our behaviours has allowed us to think about different ways of working that open up a whole new voice.
So yes, it's almost in a sense made the pressure. It's almost a falling out of that, and almost accidental inclusion is what you're saying, but something you can now see.
We don't want to go for it now.
We want it. That's right, Laura. From your experience, has that been a similar experience, or have you seen those challenges that have been put to particularly universities and their research capability and capacity? Do you see the challenge outweighing the opportunity, or some of those opportunities offering us long-term solutions?
Yes, I think the challenge in the more sort of biomedical space is not that we have a shortage of women who start off in that area, but we rapidly lose them at a certain stage in career, which is around the time you have children. And I think that the sector hasn't grappled or hasn't come to terms with having children and why that impacts women more than men, because men are also parents. So for us in our discipline, the impact of COVID-19 and the bushfires, particularly in this state, probably won't change that, except that the pipeline beyond that sort of mid-career stage is not going to get any bigger. It's not going to be easier. But if I think of a couple of sort of positives that have come out of this, one of the challenges for women in a scientific environment and workplace is this idea you have to work from 9 to 5. How am I going to get my kids to school, or how am I going to go and make sure that my elderly mother's okay? How do I juggle all these things? And the idea that we can now do business online or virtually makes that much easier to do, because you can actually do multiple things as we're able to do, but we don't have to spend time going to one place or another. So we can remain at home, manage sort of the situation at home, and still feel that we're work. So this whole idea about flexible workplace, I think, is something that's going to come out of this. And I think another point I'd like to make, and this might be thinking about our future generation, we have a group of year 10, year 11, year 12 students who will have been impacted by this. 2020 is going to be that unusual year. COVID-19, it's about understanding disease or vaccine development. If that was never, this is a wonderful time to say, now's the time to come on board and get into science, because this is a real problem. And I think if we could start this kind of conversation at school level, it's around embracing science as a wonderful career, but we'll need to find ways of being flexible, you know, to be able to, I think, change with the changing expectations.
So thank you. So that insecurity of employment that creates more insecurity often for women, and particularly at times of having a family.
Yes.
And so some of the solutions that have emerged in that accidental way, but have given confidence, as Emily was saying, that they could be for the long haul.
Yes, I believe so. And I think really on another level, it's how do we judge ourselves in science? How do we know we're doing a good job? And I think if we, it's one of these areas, I don't think we've really got that right.
We might come back to that as a really key point and the solution to that. Karen, from your perspective, do you see in the way you're navigating that national program of building capability, the Medical Device Partnership Program, Medical Device Research Institute, the here and now research into the future medical devices, so encompassing that biomedical into engineering and industry, do you see the impact that's occurred in this past 12, maybe 18 months now, disrupting that significantly and providing either challenge or opportunity for women in particular?
Some interesting questions in there. I mean, certainly the I guess all the events of the last few months relating to COVID have alerted the community to things like, I'm thinking even just to one of the things that we're doing, which is in testing face masks, and we're doing that together with Emily actually. But it has alerted, I think, the community to the importance of, firstly, you know, healthcare and health prevention, but actually the complexities of something that looks just as simple as a face mask. It looks like a piece of cloth you put across your face, but actually there are a lot of scientific concepts that go behind that. And I think that kind of thing is providing opportunity for us to at least start those conversations at a community level. We're currently looking at trying to provide standards for people who are developing their own face masks. So I think, you know, just alerting the community to the complexities of some of these seemingly really simple things. I'll just pick up a little bit on a comment just here about, you know, that it's at school where I think we really need to try and bring students along, and maybe COVID offers some kind of opportunity there. So my kids, who are now sort of late teens, I know when they were sort of coming through primary school, they had science lessons, but science has always had this kind of stigma associated with it, and I think that starts at primary school, and I talked to a friend who said, yes, her primary school kids used to go to the science lesson, which was at the far side of the campus, and they had 2 hours a week, and no one ever liked walking all the way to the science labs, and then they'd walk back, and that was science, and you know, it already had a big cross against it. So I think just one of the really important things to me is, you know, not everybody's going to become a scientist, but I think everybody should appreciate the role of science in the community. So, you know, all the kids get up in the morning, you know, the first thing they do is pick up their phone, then they might use Siri, voice recognition, then they'll potentially look at the weather forecast. You know, there's modelling, lots of modelling that goes behind weather forecasting. All of this is science, and yet they wouldn't see it as science. So, you know, go for a walk in the forest and admire the trees. There's nature. It's science. So how can we inspire the kids younger to think that science is something really valuable and something important, and it's not just about going to a lab at the other side of campus for 2 hours and then, you know, coming back and then doing the stuff that they like. So I think getting the message out there to the community is really important, and I think, you know, COVID and the bushfires and things do offer us some kind of opportunity to do that. It's difficult, but I think it's important. I guess then just sort of going back to the people who are working in my field, and particularly the younger females working in universities, and certainly there'll be a disproportionate number of those who are probably on short-term or casual contracts. And unfortunately, in the way that the budgets are being formulated, you know, they're going to be the first ones to lose their jobs, and that's what's really unfortunate. You know, you can understand that they will be the first ones to if there's going to be cuts made, but you know, how can we try and support them when there's that kind of threat going on at the same time?
So that's really the here and now issue facing all universities, no matter where they are in Australia. Nikki, insecure employment, women faring less well in insecure employment, particularly with childcare or caring responsibilities. That's not a new message, but is it surprising to you that in a field such as science and engineering and technology, with that future view of a world, which Karen has said everything is related to, to the field and its impact on our lives, is it surprising to you that that level of insecurity for women should be still at a significant level, and in fact, what solutions do can you bring in from perhaps other fields that might help us navigate some of the impact of COVID on that insecurity?
Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. Like most areas of work, they were designed by men for men, and men who traditionally had a wife at home to take care of the children and all the cooking and cleaning, etc., etc. So whilst women have been added in, the structure of the system hasn't changed. And what COVID-19 in particular has shown is that structural inequalities across numerous sectors, and science is no different, I think, in that regard. As you've mentioned, all of you have mentioned the issues of insecure work, part-time work, casual work. Women are across the board much more likely to be in insecure work, and have been much more likely to lose their jobs as a result of the pandemic, and probably less likely to be able to bounce back from it. So unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me. I think that there's been a lot of things raised across the panel. I think it gets back to gender inequality right from the very word go, right from the moment children are born. We are concerned about whether we're having a boy or a girl, and we will treat them often differently depending on which gender they happen to be born. And I think we've really got to start tackling gender bias, unconscious bias right from school, and particularly in STEM areas where it's still very prevalent. As you said, Karen, bringing the realisation to young people that STEM isn't just about kind of being in a chemistry lab or whatever, that there's a lot more to it than that. But unfortunately, it's still very much a stereotype that exists, that it's for boys. And we're not going to make any significant changes unless we tackle that gender bias right from the beginning that's very embedded in our society.
So we have three science leaders here, and who appoint people into key roles. And what challenges would you face in redressing some of the balance in appointing women only? That's often the fields can kind of go into that really long academic debate about moving in that direction. Is there a case in looking at the impact of the last 12 months, particular case, in being more active in that domain? Laura?
Well, Caroline, at Melbourne University, we did this in the mathematics, and I'm extremely keen to look at this in the Faculty of Sciences at the University of Adelaide. And in fact, I am about to recruit or advertise for a position for women only. The reason for that is that in a particular area there are no women, and as hard as it is, and people often ask me, would I apply for a women-only position? We need to be very clear here. You don't get appointed into a role because you're a woman. You get appointed into a role because you are an outstanding candidate and the right person for that job. So it's around the messaging, because I think recruitment is actually a key issue here. Many of the way or the terminology, the text around a position description or when you discuss a job, it's very masculine. And it come back down to the measures here. So I think women-only positions or recruitments are important to get the ball rolling. The important thing is a recruit under that sort of scheme must never feel that they were appointed because of their gender. And it's then important to give them visibility around the excellence that they do. So I'm actually a fan of that, but let's see how this works out.
Emily, is it a solution? Is it the only solution? How do you reflect on that as a leader?
So it's not the only solution, but I'm absolutely convinced that it is a solution. I used to be in an environment where I was not the only woman. I was the only one they had ever appointed to a tenured position and the only one who'd ever gone past level B. And that is still the case, I believe. They may have just promoted someone to level C that they've recently recruited. But a number of years ago, soon after I started here, had the opportunity to recruit women only into some positions funded through our partnership with University College London, supported by Santos. And it was a line ball decision about whether we went out for women only, because you don't know what the reaction would be to that. And I think it came support right from the top that is what we would do. I think it was the best decision we ever made. And just because it felt like the right thing to do, we didn't just go out with these positions. I spent a lot of time talking about why we were doing it. We had 16% women in the institute. And you could see that these were mostly the early career researchers. We needed to address that balance, and we gave our male colleagues a narrative that they could share, and they were out speaking the positions. So we had 89 applications from women, and if I was at that stage of career, I would not have wanted to be up against these women. It was amazing. We had 9 applications from men. Some who insisted that we had it all wrong and we should interview them. We had 2 positions and we appointed 3 women because we couldn't. And so we actually filled another position at the same time. And they're just absolutely fabulous. They've all gone on to do great things. And it's been one of the best decisions I think we've ever made. And what was really nice then was to see their male colleagues boasting about these fabulous women we've recruited. There were also other women who applied for those positions who weren't the right technical fit, but have since, at least one of them has since joined us for the Future Fellowship. And it's just great to see that made a difference. We've never had so many applications for a position. Almost all of the applications were from women that we hadn't seen in other positions we'd advertised. So it completely shifted my thinking on the impact it could have.
Karen?
Oh, we lost.
Oh, no, sorry, still recording. Oh, great. So we may not see our audience, but our audience can certainly see and hear us. So Karen.
So, I think there's definitely a role for it. I guess my major comment though is once you've made those appointments, you need to make sure that the structure and the processes and support is in place for those people, because it's no good just saying we're only going to appoint women and then we're going to throw them into the same system that's always existed and expect them to behave like a man, because it won't work.
That's right.
And I'll give you a couple of examples of where I've struggled in that instance. And we didn't have a particular call that was specifically for women, but where we have employed a woman. And one was where I was fortunate to win an NHMRC grant. And for anyone not from academia, these are fairly well sought after grants, and you're really pleased that you've got one. and I employed an outstanding woman as a research associate on this grant. She then became pregnant, which was fabulous, and we brought in someone in to stand in for her while she was on maternity leave, who was also female. She then became pregnant. By this stage then, the original employee came back. She got pregnant for the second time. So I had an NHMRC grant, which in the end lasted, I think, because the NHMRC were fabulous and allowed us to extend the grant. So it all worked out very well. We had a successful outcomes where we had, you know, good research outcomes and 3 babies. But the response I got back from the field in trying to then continue that work was, why did it take so long, and why haven't you done this, and why haven't you done that? And now it's sort of getting a bit old in the tooth. So although we were doing the right thing, and you know they were fabulous people, but it just, in terms of the outcomes and trying to then continue the work in the outside field, became really difficult.
So thank you, Emily.
There's something I would add to that, because one of the things that I think we talked about the challenges of women largely being on fixed term contracts and navigating the challenges. And I tell people all the time that one of the things I'm most proud of since we formed the Institute 5 years ago is the number of babies, because that tells you you've got a safe working environment for women.
Yeah.
People are having babies and we love it. But the one of the challenges I've seen is that there is a real disparity for a woman who has a continuing position and one who doesn't, in terms of the risk around taking maternity leave, what happens when they come back. And the number of women I've spoken to have said, I would have loved to have spent more time with my baby, but really if I was away for more than 3 months, I wasn't going to have that job to come back to. The contract would have ended and there would have been no chance of a further contract. And I think this is something which is, you know, it's really distressing when you hear people making these decisions because of the perceived security of employment.
That comes to Laura's comment, you know, about the way we assess progression and performance. Laura, I think you had time in the ARC and engaged with a large number of processes around appointment, retention, development of women. Where do you see we've got a system that's not a right fit for the people in it?
Because of the measures we use in science about determining excellence, it's around time-specific things. Just as you said, you might have been penalised because in that time frame of 3 years, your outputs were less than a comparator. But in actual fact, if you looked at 6 years, you had excellent outcomes. So I think the challenge broadly for the sector, and this is in terms of winning grants or being awarded fellowships or even getting a job, you're being measured over a specific frame of time that might have been interrupted. So I think this is a sector, we are not good at understanding the impact of interruptions to career, nor, well, that could be for family reasons, nor understanding that perhaps some sites takes longer, you know, than others. And I don't know how we begin this. I think we can begin this at the university level or at the institute level, is rethink how we're measuring excellence or productivity.
Yes, or the time frame.
And the time frame. In fact, we use the term relative to opportunity a lot, but do we understand it?
Nikki, have other fields grappled with this and found some innovative solutions?
Oh, I don't know that anyone's doing this brilliantly. I think the imperative now with science, because we've seen the critical importance of science in this pandemic, I think it's probably opened up greater possibilities here. I actually wanted to comment on what Laura was saying. I saw as COVID hit and everyone went into lockdown, a couple who were both academics, and the husband was saying, oh, well, you know, at least I'll get some publications written. And the wife was saying, well, there's no chance for me because she had children and was doing the homeschooling and, you know, and it's really that inequality around parenting, which you raised when you first spoke, Laura. You know, the men are parents too, but that is not equally shared. And I think the other thing about being in academia is that, publication pressure and those breaks, exactly as you were talking about, Karen. Look, I think I'm going to spruik something that I think is pretty innovative in Victoria, which is their new Gender Equality Act of 2020. And it will require 300 public sector organisations, including all of the university sector in Victoria, to do a gender equity audit and then monitor gender equity across their organisations and make measurable progress every 2 years. Otherwise, they can be actually eventually sent to the VCAT, the tribunal, to respond to why they haven't made that progress. I'm with you. I think, putting in some targets and quotas, which is what the Gender Equality Act will do, will help rocket fuel change, which is so slow, and I think that has the potential then to have flow-on effects throughout the rest of the economy. And I hope that it will flow throughout the rest of Australia. As an example, it's going to be kind of a social experiment, I think, for Victoria, for the rest of Australia as well.
And that reminds me of the Athena Swan program, Science Women Academic Network program. That was, it's been introduced. It's a much tougher standard, if you will. It's a no tick the box exercise for a university to get a bronze award, and that's where it started. It was brought over from the Equality Challenge Unit in the UK and has been, in a sense, worked through to meet Australian circumstances. Now, in the UK, it wasn't really paid that much attention until Dame Sally Davis actually said she was rather concerned that particularly medical research institutes and faculties of health medicine hadn't quite moved forwards with the Athena Swan program. So she outlined that in order to be competitive, I think it was for the NHS clinical funding stream, you had to have a silver award. And many vice chancellors and heads of institutes found their inner equity. Do you think it's timely for Australia to do likewise? Because in a sense, that seems to have been a true game changer, no matter the motive, the outcome, and then the ensuing embedding of different practices. Karen, can you see that being a prerequisite for the ARC or NHMRC?
So, I think it's a good idea. It was something that was certainly flagged when we were all being encouraged to be involved through the Athena Swan programme, and maybe again that was that underlying thought process that if the universities weren't involved in Athena Swan, that at some point they would no longer be eligible to apply for ARC and NHMRC. Even if that doesn't come to fruition, I think the fact that was there encouraged the universities to become involved in the programme. And by becoming involved in the programme, it has at least made the universities start to think about these things and to become, I guess, more aware of some of the issues within the universities and actually trying to address them. So I think whether it's just a threat or whether it's reality, I think it has started to get the universities to think about these things where perhaps they haven't in some instances. And, maybe it should go ahead and say, yeah, now anyone who hasn't started to engage properly, actually they won't be eligible for funding.
And it seems to me there's a great deal of worry about pushback and kickback and it wasn't quite right for science. Emily, do you think it's quite right or exactly right? Or not at all right?
Exactly right, but I'm reflecting on something you said there before, Caroline, about actions, because the challenge with things like Athena Swan and Sage here is making sure that it doesn't become a checklist where you talk about being able to look at your organisation from the outside and tick things off, but rather that it demands actions over time and a demonstration that that's continuing over time. Because I think that's the biggest risk that we have here, is that if you have something, the real test for our universities and the medical research institutes and others who've signed up for this is going to be about what actions they take and what they can demonstrate over time, because otherwise you can have the most beautiful framework, but you don't see any change around it. And you can find a way to say, look, we've got all of these things, but that piece that Karen mentioned before about making sure that if you make appointments and you make these changes, that you create an environment and an ongoing environment where people can flourish rather than feel actually even worse than they did before they came in.
Yeah.
Leadership and culture.
Yeah.
Laura?
And I think what is really interesting, and you asked sort of about barriers, and I do think it's worth touching on the fact that for women, sometimes the biggest barrier is themselves, and that we don't believe in ourselves, and so perhaps rather than reducing funding for an organisation that didn't comply, it'd be encouraging women. So there are very, very few women who lead big infrastructure bids for big pieces of equipment. There are very few women who run big centres, and often that's because the sense is, well, you need to be a professor, and obviously there are so few professors. What if we could just break that barrier down, that women can lead from quite an early age? So we have this stereotype about a professor has to lead, and in fact they don't at all. And then you can bring in sort of people, and so I think that the universities and institutes have to change that. Is be willing to embrace leadership at an earlier age.
Now, male champions have changed. Now, Nikki, you've championed and had great success with male champions of change. Is this right in science, in that majority culture, which is where male champions of change have actually had impact? Nikki, that's been a positive story.
I think so. Yes, I think. I think that again, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a useful thing to have men champion women in science, and so there is a male champions of change STEM group that's very active, and I think that's important. But it's just one thing among many that need to change. And I think, as you've all said, we can do all of this surface level change, bring more women in, but unless the culture that they're coming into changes accordingly, and men are prepared to pick up half the burden of taking care of children, etc., then it's going to remain a challenge, I think. But there are great solutions, great partial solutions.
One thing, perhaps before we go to questions, and I'm sure we've got lots of questions coming through, it does strike me. I trained in medicine originally before I saw the light, and decided I wanted to find out more about what was not known than practice that was known. But had I been in medicine and taken time off, and gone through the College of Physicians or the College of Surgeons, perhaps College of Physicians, I would reasonably have had been part of a profession in which professional obligations were clear and professional responsibilities were clear, but also where conditions of appointment and remuneration were also clear, determined by the level to which your training and competency was appropriate. Engineers, similar. Lawyers, similar. All professions have large bodies that have, to a greater or lesser extent, established parity of qualifications and competencies and what remuneration or standards of employment would be appropriate. In science, we have credentialed doctorate fellows who may then be very grateful for have a 2-day-a-week job in perhaps an industry lab or perhaps a university lab, really doing very, very basic tasks and grateful to be part of the science community. In a sense, you would never find somebody who was a accredited physician, working in the back room of the emergency system, collecting blood, because that was a job available to them. But there's a question I have. We have insecurity because we don't have a professional body as a hypothesis. We don't have a professional body which allows retraining competencies in new technologies, the opportunity to move between CSIRO, university, industry, startups, and understand the level of what job employment and conditions would be. And particularly our community does not see science as a profession in the same way as it sees medicine and law and other great professions. And part of that is that absence of really a national, clear professional body. Is it time, or would that have any impact at all on what we've been discussing? It's just that insecure employment, which is science, and women in insecure employment do even less well. Would it actually provide a safety net at worst and a professional standing at best for our community? Karen.
Thought you might ask one of the scientists that question.
I think engineers, engineers in a sense, by saying you're an engineer, your eyebrows of parents don't go up.
So perhaps I can just talk about it from the engineering perspective, because some of the comments you've made are true. We have engineering is a profession, but also, to be honest, the term engineer is used much more broadly than the profession. So in fact, and again, as the general public, when they think of the term engineer, don't necessarily think of professional engineers always. So, I was sitting on an aeroplane and there was a problem with one of the seats, and they said they were going to call in the seating engineer, and a bloke with a spanner came on. And I'm sure he wasn't an engineer as you would think of a professional engineer. So engineering is a very broad term. So although we do have professional accreditation and so on and so forth, that's not necessarily something that's universally understood, I think, from outside of the profession, perhaps. And there was another comment I was going to make, and I've forgotten what it was.
We'll come back to that. I think Emily had a comment she wanted to come in with.
It's a really interesting one, because we've tried to tackle it at a discipline level in science. And I don't know a discipline that's been able to crack it and work through, you mentioned my involvement with the Royal Australian Chemical Institute, and I've been through multiple conversations over more than 20 years now of certified practicing chemist. What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of someone's employment status and their opportunity? But I think it comes back to that critical piece about the perception of what a scientist is. Are they a professional or not? Which is something that the breadth of it and our natural fragmentation makes us hard for us to come out and look like a professional group.
So I think the word you used is accreditation. Now, I mean, it shouldn't just be around accreditation. What would our professional standards be? I mean, we have to think about this. I'm wondering what the role we have some of our academies, and could they be playing a different role? I know that you have elected fellows, and maybe there should be some other groups in the academies, non-elected, where there could be a real push around supporting the whole discipline. At the moment, you keep thinking, yes, you have to be a very learned professor to get into the academy, but what about having the next generation academy people? So broadening the role of some of the academies to be advocates for our profession.
And the tension there for an academy is often a body to withhold the standards of excellence, as distinct from the nitty-gritty of the standards of a profession.
Yes.
That perhaps being a supervisor for a doctoral student might take, a degree or more than a degree, and so forth. But also the retraining and the new training and the ability to support those who were qualified in STEM at a whatever level and to move forwards. It's worth thinking through because there are many pros and cons. Nikki, did you have something?
Well, I was going to say the two other examples that you gave, which were medicine and the legal profession, are still, have horrendous gender bias, and as we've seen lately, just sexual harassment problems. So I don't think per se that's going to solve the problem for women in science. I think you'd have to have a different sort of structure and think more carefully than those professions have until now about how you mitigate some of the unconscious bias that occurs right the way through those professions.
It's whether having a professional body at all is the beginning, and then shaping a professional body that delivers on on the agenda, as distinct from one that was formed from a craft and a guild, steeped in history and therefore isn't likely to change anytime soon. But nevertheless, parents will always ask me, so, Chief Scientist, how long have you been a scientist? So I try and lie, I say 20 years. Don't want to go too far. And I go, really? Can you be a scientist for that long? Yeah, apparently. so they're just to begin the conversation, a different place and a professional place that does offer some protection whilst not necessarily being perfect. Could be something to consider. Now, colleagues, I think we have questions coming through. We have a question. Thank you. Please, as you're listening, please do feel free to put your questions through to us. Now, this is a tough one. There is a fundamental challenge in competitive research, and the word there is competitive, and that is that the rest of the world is not going to wait until a young mum or dad return from parental leave and complete their discovery. Serious lack of longer-term job security in research and STEM in Australia makes it very hard to be competitive. And over a short period of time in a career, and given the disruptions such as parental duties or COVID-19, I think we must give the young and up-and-coming researchers, the early mid-career researchers, more time to show us what they're capable of, and not just push them to do so on a year-by-year short-term contract basis. So I wonder if the panel could comment on how a longer-term job security impacted their careers or the careers of early and mid-career researchers they know or mentored. What did you see was the value of that longer-term job security? And as you reflect on it, you know, perhaps the other side to this question is, where did you see the lack of it impacted on talented individuals? Emily?
Great question.
In your own career or that of others?
So I had a real reality check on this a few years ago when one of my oldest friends went to a career development panel session, and a couple of my other friends were on the panel, and I said to him afterwards, I said, was that a good session? He said, what I've learned, he'd been on almost short-term contracts for almost 20 years. He's now finally got an ongoing position. And he said to me, what I've learned is that job security is all about luck and being in the right place at the right time, and I can't do anything about it. And it was meant to be an uplifting session, and it hit me and thought, wow, he's got a really good point on this, and made me think a lot about this security. I came back to Australia after doing 2 postdocs overseas into a position where the first meeting I had with my head of school, as I said before, I was only the second woman they employed as an academic in chemistry there at the University of Tasmania. The first meeting I had with him was to make sure I knew that it was a 4-year position only and there would be nothing after it. Going, that was a nice welcome. And he was just making sure that he was honest with me. And I was very, very lucky. Comes to that luck piece when 2 years later, with the retirement coming up, I was on an ARC fellowship, which is why I had a position at all. I was able to apply for a position and I was successful. And it was a game changer for me. I took risks that I wouldn't have taken otherwise. I won another ARC fellowship because I felt brave enough even to apply for it. As Laura was talking about before, I was given an opportunity as a newly promoted senior lecturer to take on a university-wide position that I'll be forever grateful to the person who gave me that opportunity, because everyone said, oh, she's too young, she's too inexperienced. And he said, well, I want someone who's not going to do it the way it's always been done, and this is the only way I can do that. And it completely changed the opportunities for me and the way I thought about it. And I have a really strong view on this, that I think that we need to be much braver about offering secure employment, because that is what will allow people to build and develop, and to be much braver about how we manage performance in the workplace, rather than saying that our only way to manage performance is to have a fixed term employment, which means we can just be gutless and let them go at the end of the contract. So to have honest conversations about what performance is, about what progression means, and provide people with the stability that they can take risks and then do those great things. So,
Laura.
Emily's absolutely nailed it. It's around having honest conversations for those ECRs and mid-careers who might be mid-career academics, people at stage of career, this is a terrible time to be in this sector. But it's probably not quite as bad as being in the travel business or in hospitality. So it doesn't make it any easier. And therefore, it is around having an honest conversation, because to offer someone a continuing position is almost now you're going to need a crystal ball to be able to know whether you can do that. But what we do need are much better solutions for retaining people in the workplace through maybe bridging positions, or so that you can have a continuum in a single organisation, but the source of that income may differ. So there may be a bridging between fellowships or bridging between, I don't know, some contracts. But I think the challenge for the sector or in academia is that a continuing position, they may not exist anymore. There may be no such thing as tenure, and I don't think that would be a bad thing.
Karen, your view?
So I was, I guess, very fortunate in my career that there were positions that, so I was on short-term postdoc type contracts for only a relatively short time. This was in the UK, and there just happened to be one available when I got to the end of one, so I was really fortunate. I moved to Adelaide to follow a lectureship. It was a 3-year contract, I think, and then was fortunate again to be made permanent on that. So I've been really fortunate in my career, but obviously I've seen over the time of the 20 years of science I've done too, to sort of experience what other of the junior academics, and particularly the girls, is going through. And I think one of the problems with always having to then apply for a new position is that, and this is a generalisation, but girls are not very good at self-promotion. And so what will happen is a job will come up and it will be, oh, well, I'm not sure I'm qualified for that, or I don't meet one of the criteria by that much, whereas, there's probably a man in the same position who probably doesn't meet 3 of the criteria, but he'll go for it anyway. So just always having to go through this process of self-promotion and writing your CV and telling everyone how wonderful you are, a lot of the girls that I've worked with find that really hard. So I think providing that support for them, providing mentoring, helping them do this and giving them the confidence to be able to do that self-promotion, I think is a really important part of the puzzle. And I've got examples, and there's an example where, and it sort of ties back to the original question, which was around COVID, where I have a recent PhD graduate. She actually did a master's in one of the top 10 universities in the world, has now gone on and got a postdoc in one of the top 10 universities of the world. She has continued to talk with me, and it's her issue is that, oh, well, because she's now having to work from home through the COVID thing, it's like, well, I don't want to. I said, well, you need to still continue to get output. If you're going to continue to get ongoing positions, you need to continue to produce papers and so on and so forth. She said, oh, well, I don't want to be a burden on him, and I don't want. I said, he's your supervisor. It's his responsibility to find you something to do, because even if you can't do the job you were originally employed to do, which was to collect data from people in a hospital, you need to find something you can do, and you're going to have to push with him to get that. And he's a very nice guy and he's very reasonable, but she just needs the confidence to be able to say those kind of things. So it's a really hard thing, and I think really that role of trying to just mentor and support and provide encouragement is so important for the particularly the girls. That's a generalisation, but I think it's really important.
One thing I do think institutions could be so much better at is thinking about fit in the long term. Not everyone who comes through and has done their PhD and enjoys that early phase postdoc is actually really going to go through to run a lab or to run an institution. And leadership training we do particularly badly. You know, everyone thinks you need to be a leading researcher to be a research leader. Well, it's necessary to some level, but it's not sufficient. So where do we bring leadership skills, leadership training, helping people navigate careers that may link across to industry, not as second best, but as actually primary roles in a nation in which our ability to have industry research collaboration in STEM is in the lowest quartile of the OECD, and in this state in the lowest quartile of the OECD. Those are prime positions where you can walk across the STEM research, development, innovation interface. So key, but no one will necessarily feel comfortable in providing that training or awareness for their trainees, because it's not a journey they've taken themselves. And yet being able to run a very large technology facility requires immense skill and foresight. And yet again, not everyone feels comfortable in positioning. So in terms of career mentorship and leadership, again, we often rely on the single leader in a single lab who may or may not have insight and foresight and great judgment, but who often is busy trying to maintain their own career. So I think that career paths, if it's not within an institution, it's got to be with some organisation that can provide that at a professional level. And perhaps, you know, that differentiation of streams and skill sets becomes a bit more evident, perhaps. You know, I think anything might be better than the paths that our panel might have taken through, and the advice being given. I often call it being killed by kindness, or actually the wonderment of people that you're in a position of leadership at all. I remember coming into my first head of department role and thinking, oh, there we go, that's quite good. I've been to a couple of good institutions, I've got a couple of good qualifications, I'm doing pretty well, got NHMRC, I felt quite capable, and told my very first meeting with staff, I said, why do you think they appointed you? Took me back a little. Amazingly qualified for the job, really.
I have one slightly worse than that, where I had one of my older male colleagues come in and say, you know that you're only here because you're a woman. So, you're free to your opinion.
I think that's part of the problem as well with self-promotion, that the women are penalised often for self-promotion. You know, there's an unconscious bias that women are too pushy, etc., etc. So they, you know, that's often where the lack of confidence comes from. It's in that intuitive awareness that it's not seen as appropriate. Whereas men can be as pushy, you know, they can overstep the mark, but they can be a lot pushier in promoting themselves. So, yeah.
There's a fabulous piece of work called Navigating the Labyrinth of Leadership by Carly and Eagley in Harvard Business Review. And if people haven't read it, it's absolutely critical to understanding why the path of it's not a glass ceiling. You don't suddenly keep going and suddenly you hit a ceiling. It's the complexity of a labyrinth, mixed signals, miscues. And the wonderful message I took from that is women aren't good at self-promotion because we're often quite apologetic about most things, everything. When we sit down, we're really sorry to be here at all, and we're really sorry we're credentialed, and we're particularly sorry we're successful, you know. And on the other hand, if we say, well, actually, yes, I did quite well, really, you're immediately targeted as assertive. So between the two, so you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So what it was for me was such clarity in which it was written. I felt, well, at least now I understand it. It is a system through which I'm trying to navigate the labyrinth, and it's not all down to me, which is, of course, the internalisation that we do. So, look, do we have any? We've got some more questions coming through, and I think in the last 5 minutes of our discussion, that will be terrific. Thank you. Can the panel comment on why is it so hard to match the conceptual investment in STEM, which comes up a lot, with funding investment in people, not buildings? So this echoes, I think, the SAPC interim report on health and medical research. So, you know, why are we not matching the ability to balance investment in people rather than buildings? Oh, who shall I take that across to? I'm going to take, I'll take that across to Karen. Karen.
Well, I think, so South Australia has done a fabulous job, I think, of investing in buildings. And that's all great. What we can't do now is to just sit back and say, okay, we've done the job. And I think that's the kind of, that's where the risk is. And absolutely the next step has got to be invest in people, because you can have lots of lovely, beautiful, empty buildings, and unless we invest in the people, we're never going to get anywhere. So why, I don't know, but absolutely we need to do it, is the bottom line. So if you just take that on board, Caroline, and a lot of people, that would be fabulous.
So the value proposition, isn't it? So if there are sunk costs of buildings made by governments, the expectation may be there's been a sort of a description of what that building will deliver. And so the issue is then, is the building delivering that?
And if I can, so I was talking to another state government, and I'm not going to say which one it was, but they were, and this is going back probably a couple of years, they were saying, well, we've already made a very big investment in science and it's not making any difference. And of course they were talking again about investment in facility. And, my question to them was, how on earth do you expect it to have made a difference unless you put people in there to actually do the science? And I just feel there's an education piece that needs to go on here to explain to government that science doesn't happen because of a building.
Terrific. Emily?
I'm not even sure it's as much an education piece as what we choose to measure. You can put great metrics around a building. You can say, the day I started at UniSA, they were building a crane to start building a building. And now you can see that building's there and it's got all the bits that they said it was going to have. We gave you the money, here's the building. We find it so much harder to do that with people. We're here talking about how do you measure someone relative to opportunity. And so we've got it in our heads. It's always easier to go with the thing where you can measure, where you can go and say, look, we gave them that money and that's what they did with it. And until we can move past that, we won't value the human side in the same way we value the physical infrastructure.
Sometimes as well, we're a bit reluctant to say that building is for a purpose and we now have to deliver on that purpose. And if that purpose isn't delivered in 5 years or 10 years, a government may say, why did we do that? So the reluctance to invest further becomes, where was the value proposition for the investment? Was it delivered on? Because reasonably there's a return on investment for any part of activity.
I think obviously with a building, it's very easy to then take visiting dignitaries and this, that and the other around and point at it and say, this is where we've put our money, isn't it fabulous? Just taking them to point at a person or to show them a scientific paper that may lead to something really, really important. It's just, from their perspective, really has very little value. And I think, that's part of the problem, is just being able to have this nice, shiny kind of flag that can be waved around.
Does it help recruit great scientists? It often does, actually.
It does.
Absolutely. So in a sense, the building can be the recruitment arm. It's just that leadership to harness the asset to bring people through.
The buildings have certainly got a lot of value, but you can't have the buildings without people.
But whose role is it to recruit and bring people in? Is that institute leaders and faculty leaders like yourselves? Or is it the government to go out and find people? I'm asking that, Dorothy Dixon, because I'm just enjoying having a bit of discussion there. Quickly moving on to the next question, but thank you, Simon. Second question, international peer organisations have a staff scientist role for a career scientist who are not aspiring to be lab heads, and it's not seen as a failure. Why can't we embrace this? Come back to our discussion, Laura.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I've worked in an organisation where that existed, and we embraced the fact that we have academics who are specialists in delivering service from an intellectual perspective. So without those individuals, the research could not be done. And yet often they're then pigeonholed into, well, you're just a technician, and that's completely wrong. So what I'd like to see in our sector, in sort of the universities, is that we recognise and embrace a category of workforce that are academic specialists.
Yeah, developing the specialisations for people's skill sets and what their value add, so they're not round peg in a square hole, whatever.
Absolutely, and the important thing is provide a career pathway and a trajectory so that they can progress in their career just like other academics or staff. So.
And look, I think the final question today, because this almost sums it up, and it's such an important question, which we've touched on, gender-related initiatives in STEM will work towards a gender balance in the workplace, all for it. Unfortunately, these initiatives can feed uncertainty, such as imposter syndrome, in the early and mid-career researchers who are employed through them. But are we looking out for such issues enough? So perhaps a final wrap-up, because that's such a poignant yet insightful comment. Leaders, what can we do about that? We might start with Nikki.
Oh, such a big question, isn't it? I remember Sam Mostyn getting appointed to the AFL board, the first woman appointed to the AFL board as part, and because they needed to fill a quota. And people said to her, "But how do you feel being just being a tick box? You've come on." And she said, "That's not what I am. I'm adequately qualified for this role, but I got selected because I'd been overlooked. I'd have been overlooked previously, and I'm okay with that." And I think that's the kind of conversation that we have to have. Now, it's all very well for someone like her because she is a very senior and very highly qualified and experienced woman. But we do have to be very mindful of that when we have make exceptions and bring in women as part of a quota or target or whatever, that isn't how they feel. And I think we've got, if we do that, we'll get over that with that first tranche of women coming in, and after that it paves the way for the others. So I think it's a short-term problem, but we definitely need to address it.
Karen?
I think imposter syndrome is a real issue, and I don't think it's actually restricted to the more junior people. I mean, I would probably say that several people in this room suffer from imposter syndrome. And let me give you an example of that from my own perspective. Is I was fortunate to win a fairly significant engineering award, and as I came off the stage, there was a guy from the press waiting there for me, and he said, "Did you win this award because you were a woman?" I was like, "I've just won this big engineering award," and it's. I said, "Well, actually, I kind of rather hoped I'd won it because of what I'd achieved." But so those kind of comments are very flippant, but they really dig hard, and I think just trying to educate people again that this is just not on. Women achieve things because of what they. Women get to positions because of what they achieve, not because they are women.
And Laura?
I'm also, I have to confess, going through an imposter syndrome sort of situation, which comes back to the point I made earlier, that sometimes we are our own barriers. And for the early career and mid-career, those who I've engaged with, I can see the emerging leadership. So why wait? In fact, I managed to persuade a level E, they were a man, but a level C, to take on the role of the centre director, completely unheard of. He was completely the right person for that position. And I was advised, no, you must have a level E. No, I've found the right person. So I think it's you can see the problems. You're on the ground. You're at the coalface. You have solutions to problems. We'd love to hear about them. So sort of don't hold back. Don't think you have to wait. And I think another sort of thing I've learned, this is my imposter syndrome thing. You'd walk into a room and think, oh my goodness, not many men in here. And the tendency is, excuse me, you'd sit on the corner just because you feel a bit more comfortable. I've learned, no, go and sit right in the middle. Make sure you are in the middle of everyone, and whoever's running the meeting, make sure you're sitting opposite them. And so assert yourself in that respectful way, but don't allow the imposter syndrome to take over. And I think if we were talking about training in the future, we should include how do we overcome that. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. Emily, very.
Yeah, look, I think that if there's one message that those who are early and mid-career researchers get from this, is that this imposter syndrome thing doesn't go away. You just get better at managing it.
Yes, exactly.
So you have plenty of moments where you're going, oh my goodness, they have no idea that I don't have a clue, but I've just got to keep going and hope that they don't work it out.
Yeah.
And the number of times I've said that to people and they said, really? You were worried then? I went, I'm sure I don't know what I'm doing a lot of the time. And then you realise that you probably worked it out eventually and lots of other people are doing it. So I think that's a really important thing. And once you realise that, to let those in leadership roles know where there are issues. So we've talked a bit about the challenge being the structures not fitting, but those that have been in those structures for a long time might not see the problems. They've become, or they've worked out their ways around them rather than saying we have to change those structures. So you've got the opportunity to say, did you realise this? A classic one that hit me that never occurred to me. We have a limited size for your email inbox, right? That you know, so someone said to me, oh, I'm having a real struggle on my maternity leave because I have to keep emptying my inbox. This is ridiculous. So now we have a tick box in the, you know, what to do when someone goes on maternity leave, that their inbox automatically goes to maximum size. Something as simple as that, but no one had ever really thought to say it, just like, I've just got to learn to deal with this.
Yeah.
And very interestingly about imposter syndrome, I think in a way this is a piece about the male system that we've all come into, and that's only because it's the majority, not because it's a pejorative piece, it's just the majority. I've watched, and I think I've accommodated to it, a very large number of really senior credentialed men walk into a senior position, and most people will go, that's great, they can do that job. Equally senior credentialed female will take up that position. Well, let's just see how it goes. There's a question mark. So there's this reinforcing cycle about the imposter syndrome. And I think what's helpful is to recognise it after watching it occur, not only in one's own career, but in other careers, and just go, well, that's always the starting position. It means nothing about actually how well I can or can't do the job. So reasonably, it's all we can do to not reinforce that piece. Which is, as leaders, I think is an opportunity for us. What a great group of questions. What a great panel. Look, we've covered from the personal through to the structural, through to the systems issues. We've covered it in the context of the important backdrop that we're in Australia. And reasonably, I think we can see solutions that we agree may not be part of the future, and solutions that could be part of the future. So those changes lie heavy on the heads of leaders who've been so generous with their time today as part of this panel. Thank you for your questions. Please do feel free to communicate if there are any issues that you might want to raise or you think would be a great for further discussion. So thank you indeed, and thank you very much. Thank you, Nikki, Karen, Laura and Emily. Fabulous.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.